Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back. Today we're looking at a specific moment in the history of World War II. One that didn't happen on a battlefield, but in a laboratory, on a factory floor, and in the minds of engineers working under pressure. The story we're telling today is about a technological decision made years before the first shot was fired, and how that decision shaped the outcome of the entire war. Stay with us. In the summer of 1943, somewhere on the island of Sicily, a German signals officer held in his hands a small olive-drab box. It weighed less than 5 pounds. It had a telescoping antenna that doubled as the power switch. It fit comfortably in one hand. The officer turned it over, examined its construction, and began to understand that something had gone very wrong with Germany's assessment of American military capability. The device was the SCR-536, a handheld two-way radio produced by Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago, Illinois. German signals experts compiled a formal evaluation of the captured equipment and described it as extremely effective. Its lightweight construction, compact size, operational efficiency, and communication range made it ideal for forward observers and company-level infantry units. Their conclusion was direct and uncomfortable. They had nothing like it. This single captured radio was evidence of a gap that had been widening for years. Quietly, invisibly, and with catastrophic consequences for Germany's military position. The gap was not in tanks, aircraft, or artillery. Germany had competitive equipment in all of those categories. The gap was in something far less visible: the ability to move information across a battlefield faster, more reliably, and more clearly than the enemy. To understand how this gap formed, it is necessary to go back more than a decade, to a university laboratory in New York, to a patent filed in 1930, and to an invention that would reshape military communications forever. The story begins not with soldiers, but with a scientist named Edwin Howard Armstrong. Armstrong was already one of the most celebrated radio engineers in America when he began working on what he called wideband frequency modulation, FM. During World War I, while serving as a Signal Corps captain in Paris, he had invented the super heterodyne receiver, the circuit design that became the foundation of virtually every radio built in the following century. He had also invented the regenerative circuit and the super-regenerative circuit. 3 of radio's 4 fundamental innovations had come from his mind. The 4th would prove the most consequential. Armstrong filed his FM patent application in 1930. It was granted on December 26, 1933. The principle behind FM was deceptively simple in concept, but radical in its implications. Conventional AM radio, amplitude modulation, worked by varying the strength of a radio signal. A stronger signal represented one component of the transmitted sound wave. A weaker signal represented another. This was straightforward, widely understood, and fundamentally flawed. The flaw was this: any source of electrical interference could affect the amplitude of a signal. Lightning, engine ignition systems, nearby machinery, all of it blended into AM transmissions and created static. The static was not an inconvenience. It was a fundamental physical limitation of the technology. No amount of engineering could overcome it. FM worked differently. Instead of varying the amplitude of the signal, it varied the frequency itself. The receiver was designed to respond only to frequency changes, ignoring amplitude variations entirely. This meant that electrical interference, which affected amplitude, not frequency, was simply filtered out. The result was a communication system that could cut through noise that would overwhelm any AM radio. On November 6, 1935, Armstrong demonstrated FM publicly before the Institute of Radio Engineers in New York. He transmitted sounds that had never been heard clearly over radio. water being poured from a glass, paper being torn, fabric rustling, a piano playing with complete fidelity. The audience sat in silence. They had never heard such clarity from a radio transmission. The demonstration was not a novelty. It was the beginning of a revolution. The implications for military communications were immediate and profound to those who understood what they were seeing. A battlefield is the worst possible electromagnetic environment. Tank engines generate massive electrical noise. Artillery explosions create electromagnetic pulses. Aircraft engines produce constant interference. AM radios in combat were plagued by static so severe that operators frequently could not understand transmissions. Messages were repeated multiple times. Critical information was lost in the noise. FM changed all of that. Its circuits stripped out amplitude-based interference, locked onto the strongest signal, and delivered clear voice communications in conditions that made AM transmission nearly useless. In 1938, Colonel Roger Colton, director of the Signal Corps Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, made a decision that Armstrong himself later described as the most important in the history of radio. Colton directed that all future American military radios would use frequency modulation. The decision was controversial. FM required more complex circuitry, more precise manufacturing, and wider bandwidth. Many engineers argued that the added complexity outweighed the benefits. Colton overruled them. He understood what clear, reliable communications meant for soldiers under fire. Armstrong, committed entirely to the war effort, offered free use of all his FM patents to the War Department for the duration of the conflict. He asked nothing in return. Germany made a different choice. The German military stayed with amplitude modulation. This decision was not made out of ignorance. Germany had excellent radio engineers and sophisticated manufacturing capability. Companies like Telefunken, Lorenz, and Siemens produced well-built, standardized equipment. The RV-12P2000 universal pentode became the standard Wehrmacht receiver tube, produced in large quantities. German military culture prized reliability through simplicity and trusted proven technology over untested innovation. The Wehrmacht had won stunning victories in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in the Soviet Union using AM radios. Blitzkrieg had conquered most of Europe. Panzer divisions had broken through enemy defenses with devastating speed. German communications, while imperfect, had been adequate to coordinate these operations. The question German planners asked was a reasonable one. Why change what is working? The answer was one they did not yet see clearly. German early victories had been won against enemies who were surprised, unprepared, or technologically inferior. The Poles were overwhelmed in weeks. The French collapsed before they could recover from the speed of the German advance. The Soviets in 1941 were reeling from political purges that had gutted their officer corps and were pushed back hundreds of miles in the opening months of fighting. German communications had been adequate against these opponents because those opponents were already beaten. Germany had not yet faced an enemy that could match its tactical proficiency while possessing superior communications technology. Meanwhile, the industrial base that would produce that superior technology was already in motion. Galvin Manufacturing Corporation had been founded in Chicago in 1928 by Paul Galvin and his brother Joseph. The company had started by making battery eliminators for home radios before creating the Motorola brand for car radios in 1930. The name was a combination of motor and ola, meaning sound in motion. By 1936, after returning from a tour of Europe, Paul Galvin was convinced that war was imminent. He redirected company research toward military applications. When the war came, Galvin Manufacturing was prepared. In 1940, Daniel Noble joined the company as director of research. Noble had previously designed the world's first statewide FM two-way radio system for the Connecticut State Police. He understood from direct field experience what FM could accomplish in practical conditions, not just in laboratory demonstrations. When the Signal Corps issued a contract for a new portable radio using AM technology, Noble objected. He told Signal Corps officers directly that he believed this was a grave mistake and that all development effort should be redirected toward an FM portable unit. His argument was grounded in physics. No amount of engineering refinement could make AM suitable for battlefield conditions. The laws governing electromagnetic interference were not negotiable. Noble was heard. The contract was redirected. He assembled a team of engineers at the Galvin factory at 4545 West Augusta Boulevard in Chicago. His principal radio frequency designer was Henryk Magnuski, a Polish-born engineer who had graduated from Warsaw University of Technology in 1934. Magnuski had come to America before the war to continue his education and was still in the United States when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. He could not go home. His family was trapped under Nazi occupation. Magnuski channeled that knowledge into his work. He threw himself into the radio project with an intensity that impressed even his driven colleagues, working 18-hour days on circuit designs that would, if everything succeeded, help liberate the country that Germany had taken from him. Every problem he solved brought that outcome closer. Every failed circuit pushed it further away. He worked as though the answer to a personal question depended on the outcome of each engineering decision. The team produced 2 working prototypes of what would become the SCR-300 by the spring of 1942. Initial range tests were conducted in Chicago, transmitting between the roof of the Tropico Air Building and Thatcher Woods Forest Preserve. The specification called for a range of 3 miles. The prototypes achieved 8. The radios were then taken to Fort Knox, Kentucky, for formal acceptance testing before Signal Corps and infantry board officers, experienced military professionals who had seen countless promising technologies fail under field conditions and who were skeptical of civilian claims. The response at Fort Knox was described at the time as unusually enthusiastic for hard-headed military evaluators. They understood immediately what the technology meant for soldiers in combat. The SCR-300 operated on FM at 40 to 48 MHz across 41 channels. It used 18 miniature vacuum tubes in a double super heterodyne receiver. A single tuning control adjusted both transmitter and receiver simultaneously, simplifying operation under the stress of combat. An automatic frequency control circuit compensated for frequency drift. The entire unit weighed approximately 38 pounds with battery and delivered 20 to 25 hours of operation. A single soldier could carry it on his back and use it while moving. This mobility was a fundamental departure from anything previously available. Previous infantry radios had required multiple operators and could only be used from fixed positions. The SCR-300 went wherever the soldier went. Nearly 50,000 units were produced during the war. The first saw combat in the Pacific at New Georgia in August 1943. In Europe, units were airlifted for the invasion of southern Italy at Salerno in September 1943. The radio performed exactly as designed, but it was the smaller device, the one found in Sicily, that most clearly illustrated how far American technology had advanced beyond anything Germany had produced. The SCR-536 began not with a formal engineering requirement, but with an observation. In the late 1930s, Don Mitchell, chief engineer at Galvin Manufacturing, watched a National Guard exercise and noticed how vehicle-mounted radios were abandoned the moment troops had to move on foot. Commanders lost contact with their men as soon as they left their vehicles. The radio stayed behind. The soldier kept moving. Communication ended. Mitchell returned to Chicago with a conviction. Military communications had to follow the man, not the vehicle. He began designing a radio that could be carried in one hand, operated like a telephone handset. The concept was without precedent. No one had ever built a two-way radio small enough to be held in a single hand. The engineering challenges were not incremental. They required solving problems at the boundaries of what was technically possible with the components and manufacturing methods of the time. The device had to transmit and receive voice clearly across useful distances while running on batteries small enough to fit within the handset itself. Every component had to be miniaturized beyond anything previously attempted in military electronics. Mitchell and his team solved each problem methodically. They used 5 miniature vacuum tubes, each smaller than a thumb, products of the American consumer electronics industry developed for portable civilian receivers and now repurposed for war. They designed a 40-inch telescoping antenna that also served as the power switch. Extending it turned the radio on. Pushing it in turned it off. The mechanism worked in darkness and under fire. The finished device weighed 5 pounds, including batteries. It could transmit voice up to 1 mile over land and 3 miles over saltwater. It operated on AM rather than FM, which limited its noise immunity. But the compact size and weight made it invaluable for situations where the larger SCR-300 was impractical. Paratroopers needed something lightweight enough to carry during combat jumps. Every pound mattered when floating down into enemy territory. The SCR-536 found its purpose immediately. By July 1941, it was in mass production. Approximately 130,000 units were manufactured during the war. The SCR-536 first saw combat during Operation Torch, the American landings in North Africa in November 1942. Within months, it was in the hands of every American infantry company. And in Sicily, in the summer of 1943, it fell into German hands. What German signals specialists found when they examined it was not simply a piece of equipment. It was a window into a manufacturing and engineering ecosystem that Germany had not built and could not quickly replicate. Germany had no equivalent to the SCR-536. The closest German attempt at a comparable device was the Kleinfunksprechgerät D, the so-called DERTE, developed by Philips and entering service only in October 1944. More than 3 years had passed since the American radio entered mass production. Even the DORTA was not a true one-piece handheld. It was a 2-piece system requiring a separate radio unit and battery box, used with external headphones and a throat microphone. Its production was repeatedly disrupted by Allied bombing of Philips facilities in the Netherlands. Surviving examples show visible deterioration in component quality as materials became scarce. The Signal Corps obtained German portable radios and analyzed them in detail. Their classified assessment, published in Tactical and Technical Trends No. 43 in January 1944, delivered a direct comparison. The distance over which satisfactory operation could be expected from German sets was theoretically about 1/4 the distance achievable by their American equivalents. The German company-level portable radio could reach perhaps 500 meters reliably. The SCR-536 could reach a mile. The SCR-300 could reach 8 miles under open terrain conditions. This was not a marginal performance gap. It was a fundamental asymmetry that shaped how the two armies could organize their forces and respond to changing battlefield conditions. The disparity extended beyond the radios themselves into the components that made them work. Every modern radio depends on quartz crystals to maintain precise frequency control. Without crystal control, radio frequencies drift as components heat up, making it difficult to maintain contact and impossible to operate in environments where many radios must share crowded frequency bands. The United States scaled quartz crystal production from roughly 100,000 units per year in 1939 to approximately 30 million per year at peak wartime output. American industry developed new cutting techniques and quality control procedures that multiplied output 100-fold. Germany, cut off from Brazilian quartz deposits by the Allied naval blockade, produced only a fraction of what America manufactured. This forced German radios to rely more heavily on free-running oscillators rather than crystal-controlled circuits, resulting in less stable frequency management and an inability to operate in the densely channelized frequency environment that American FM radios navigated routinely. The consequence was cumulative and compounding. Less reliable frequency control meant fewer radios could operate in proximity without interfering with one another, which meant fewer radios could be deployed at forward positions, which meant fewer commanders could communicate in real time, which meant slower decisions and slower responses at every level of command. American military planners had understood the scope of the communications challenge they would face on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion would require coordinating the largest amphibious assault in history across 5 beaches spanning 50 miles of coastline. Thousands of aircraft would provide air support. Hundreds of naval vessels would bombard shore defenses. Tens of thousands of soldiers would land in the first wave alone. The Signal Corps estimated it needed approximately 90,000 transmitters for Operation Overlord. Radio channels outnumbered available frequencies 7-1. The electromagnetic spectrum over the Normandy beaches would be the most crowded in the history of warfare. The solution, narrowing the guard bands between radio channels to as little as 4 kilocycles, was made possible only by the crystal-controlled FM precision of American equipment. Without crystal control, transmitters would drift into adjacent channels and create interference that could paralyze communications at the worst possible moment. With crystal control, frequencies remained exactly where assigned, and thousands of radios could operate simultaneously without mutual interference. In the first 3 weeks after the Normandy landings, only approximately 80 interference complaints were registered among all transmitters on the beachhead. It was a remarkable operational achievement, and it went almost unnoticed because it simply worked. The Germans examining that captured SCR-536 in Sicily in 1943 were looking at more than a small radio. They were looking at the product of a decade of consumer electronics competition, a national culture of amateur radio operation, a manufacturing ecosystem that could produce miniaturized components at enormous scale, and an institutional decision made in 1938 by a Signal Corps colonel who understood what FM meant for men in combat. The gap it represented was not one that Germany could close. The question was how long it would take for that gap to determine the outcome of the war. The difference between American and German radio capability was not simply a matter of equipment specifications recorded in technical manuals. It was a difference that expressed itself in blood, in time, and in the outcomes of engagements repeated thousands of times across every theater where American and German forces met. To understand what that difference meant in practice, it is necessary to examine how each army actually used its communications on the ground. Standard German infantry organization in 1943 and 1944 placed radio equipment at company level and above. Platoon leaders, the officers commanding the smallest tactical units in direct contact with the enemy, communicated with their company headquarters by runners, by wire telephone, or by visual signals. If a German platoon leader needed to report enemy movement, needed to request fire support, or needed to coordinate with adjacent units, he sent a man running across open ground. That man was exposed to enemy observation and fire for the entire duration of his journey. He might be killed before he arrived. He might arrive and find that the situation had already changed. The information he carried was outdated the moment it left the platoon leader's mouth. An American platoon leader in the same situation spoke into his SCR-536. The message reached his company commander within seconds. The company commander spoke into his SCR-300 and reached battalion headquarters. Information moved up the chain of command in real time without exposing additional men to fire and without the delay that made tactical information obsolete before it could be acted upon. By Normandy in June 1944, every rifle company of the United States 29th Infantry Division carried 6 SCR-536 radios, 1 for each of the 3 rifle platoons, 2 for the weapons platoon, and 1 for the company commander. At battalion to regimental level, SCR-300 backpack radios provided reliable FM voice links. American infantry could coordinate at every level of command simultaneously. This asymmetry had its most decisive expression in the employment of artillery. American forward observers, averaging roughly 21 years of age, often lieutenants fresh from training, advanced with the infantry and transmitted target coordinates via FM radio to centralized fire direction centers positioned behind the lines. These centers converted targeting data into firing solutions and could mass the fires of multiple artillery batteries onto a single target within minutes of the initial report. A young officer with a radio and a pair of binoculars could bring an entire artillery battalion's firepower down on an enemy position almost instantly, then adjust fire in real time as conditions changed. The FM radio was not a convenience in this system. It was the system's foundation. Forward observers called in fire support while sheltering behind tanks, crouching in shell craters, and advancing under fire. Engine noise, artillery explosions, and electrical interference surrounded them constantly. An AM radio would have been functionally useless in such conditions. The static would have overwhelmed every transmission. FM radios cut through that environment and delivered clear voice communications regardless of what was happening around the operator. General George Patton stated publicly that artillery had won the war. He was describing precisely this integrated radio artillery system. American artillery became the most feared element of United States combat power not because American guns were technically superior to German guns, but because radio made American artillery responsive, precise, and fast in a way that German artillery could not match. German soldiers who survived the war consistently described American artillery fire as the most psychologically and physically devastating element of American combat power. It came too quickly, fell too accurately, and arrived in too great a volume to escape. The contrast was visible in the mechanics of a single engagement. A German company commander, observing American armor approaching his position, sends a runner to battalion headquarters requesting artillery support. The runner takes 5 minutes to cross open ground, assuming he survives the journey. Battalion staff assess the request and forward it to the artillery regiment. Another 5 minutes pass. The artillery calculates its firing solution and begins to engage. By the time the first shells fall, 15 to 20 minutes have elapsed since the enemy was first observed. The American armor is no longer where it was reported. The fire falls on empty ground. An American company commander observing German armor approaching his position speaks into his SCR-300. The message reaches his attached forward observer within seconds. The forward observer radios the fire direction center with target coordinates. Within 2 to 3 minutes, sometimes less, artillery rounds are impacting the exact position of the German vehicles, because the forward observer has continuous visual contact and can adjust fire in real time as the tanks attempt to maneuver. The tactical outcome of these two engagements, fought simultaneously on the same battlefield with forces of comparable size and training, is not determined by courage or tactical skill. It is determined by the speed at which information can move from the man who sees the target to the weapons that can destroy it. This principle extended beyond artillery into every element of combined arms coordination. Air support requests moved faster through American communications networks. Logistics resupply could be directed more precisely. Flanking threats could be reported and responded to before they became breakthroughs. The cumulative effect of thousands of such engagements, each individually small, was the systematic degradation of Germany's ability to fight effectively against an opponent who could simply react faster at every level of command. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 had suggested to some observers that American forces were overmatched. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had torn through inexperienced American positions, inflicting more than 6,000 casualties and capturing approximately 3,000 men. The United States Second Corps lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 guns, and 512 trucks in the initial German breakthrough. Equipment was abandoned. Units broke under pressure. The defeat was real, complete, and extensively documented. What happened next was less extensively reported, but far more consequential. The Americans recovered. Within weeks, they had reorganized their forces, relieved commanders who had failed, and implemented the lessons learned from the disaster with systematic thoroughness. General George Patton took command of Second Corps and imposed discipline and standards that transformed the formation in weeks. By May 1943, 3 months after Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner-of-war camps. The Americans who had panicked at Kasserine were among those who accepted their surrender. Germany had won the battle and lost the campaign. The radios that American soldiers carried into battle did not emerge from isolated moments of engineering genius. They were the products of an industrial ecosystem that had been developing for 2 decades, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with military planning and everything to do with the nature of the American consumer market. Understanding why American radios were better than German radios requires understanding what had built each nation's electronics industry in the years before the war began. By the early 1940s, approximately 90% of American households owned a radio receiver. This was not a military statistic, it was a commercial one, and it had driven relentless competitive pressure on manufacturers to produce equipment that was smaller, lighter, less expensive, and more reliable than whatever their competitors were offering. Vacuum tubes became smaller because consumers wanted portable receivers. Manufacturing became more precise because volume production at competitive prices demanded it. Engineers learned to pack more capability into less space because the market rewarded miniaturization and punished unnecessary bulk. When war came, this commercial expertise translated directly into military advantage. The miniature vacuum tubes that made the SCR-536 possible had not been designed for military use. They had been developed for portable civilian radios. The manufacturing techniques that allowed Galvin Manufacturing to produce 130,000 handheld radios had been refined through years of producing consumer electronics at scale. The engineering talent that Noble and McNusky represented had been developed in an environment of competitive commercial pressure that rewarded practical results. Germany had no equivalent market dynamic. Its radio industry served a smaller civilian population with less competitive pressure to miniaturize. German tubes were well engineered but designed for stationary or vehicle-mounted applications. When German engineers designed military radios, they built to military specifications using methods shaped by military requirements. They lacked the decades of consumer electronics experience that taught American engineers how to make components smaller, lighter, and more reliable within the constraints of limited power and extreme physical conditions. The scale of American industrial mobilization was itself a form of technological superiority. Raytheon mass-produced miniature and subminiature vacuum tubes, building approximately 80% of all magnetrons for American radar systems, and producing tubes rugged enough to survive being fired from artillery shells inside proximity fuses. RCA pioneered the miniature tube format that made handheld radios possible. Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of AT&T, supplied tubes and components in quantities that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Sylvania developed ultra-low power filaments critical for battery-operated equipment. The Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, employed approximately 14,000 personnel during the war and coordinated the entire development and procurement pipeline. The adjacent Camp Evans facility housed the Joint Army-Navy Tube Standardization Laboratory. Fort Monmouth's engineers had been experimenting with FM transceivers since 1936, laying the groundwork for the rapid development programs that Noble and McNusky later executed. The institutional knowledge accumulated there represented years of focused experimentation that could not be rapidly replicated by any competing power. Quartz crystal production illustrated the industrial gap in its starkest numerical form. American output scaled from roughly 100,000 crystals per year in 1939 to approximately 30 million per year at wartime peak, a 300-fold increase achieved through engineering innovation, manufacturing investment, and coordinated industrial effort. New cutting techniques were developed. Quality control procedures were invented. Facilities were built from nothing in months. Total wartime production reached tens of millions of units, representing one of the largest precision manufacturing undertakings in history. Germany, cut off from Brazilian quartz deposits by Allied naval interdiction, could produce only a fraction of this output. The consequences cascaded through every aspect of German radio capability. Without sufficient crystal-controlled oscillators, German radios drifted in frequency. Drifting frequencies created interference. Interference degraded communication quality. Degraded communications slowed information flow. Slower information meant slower decisions. Slower decisions meant slower responses to battlefield developments. The crystal shortage was not a minor supply problem. It was a fundamental constraint on German tactical effectiveness. America's civilian radio culture also provided human capital that no formal training program could replicate. By 1939, approximately 51,000 Americans held amateur radio licenses. These were men who had built their own equipment, diagnosed their own problems, and developed practical, intuitive understanding of radio propagation and circuit behavior through years of direct personal experience. When wartime regulations suspended amateur transmissions, these operators flowed directly into the military as radio technicians, signal corps officers, and communications specialists. They brought expertise that the formal training schools of 1942 and 1943 could not produce from scratch in the time available. Germany had restricted amateur radio activity before the war, viewing it as a potential security risk. German signals troops received formal military training, but they lacked the accumulated practical experience that distinguished the American amateur operator. The difference showed in maintenance, in improvisation under field conditions, and in the ability of American signals units to keep their equipment operational in conditions that would have defeated less experienced technicians. The operation that most clearly demonstrated the cumulative effect of all these advantages was the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. The Signal Corps had estimated a requirement for approximately 90,000 transmitters to support Operation Overlord. Radio channels outnumbered available frequencies by a ratio of 7-to-1. The electromagnetic environment over the invasion beaches would be the most densely populated in the history of warfare. If radios interfered with each other on that morning, if commanders lost contact with their units in the first hours of the assault, the entire operation could unravel before it established itself ashore. The solution required narrowing guard bands between assigned frequencies to as little as 4 kilocycles, an approach made possible only by the frequency precision of crystal-controlled FM transmitters. Without that precision, frequencies would drift into adjacent channels, and the resulting interference would be catastrophic. With it, thousands of radios could operate simultaneously in close proximity with minimal mutual interference. In the first 3 weeks after the landings, only approximately 80 interference complaints were registered among all transmitters operating on the beachhead. The communications infrastructure of the largest amphibious operation in history functioned as designed. It did so because American industry had produced the technology, the components, and the manufacturing quality that made it work. The Germans had no equivalent capability. Their frequency management challenges, compounded by crystal shortages and AM technology, meant they could not have managed the electromagnetic density that American planners had successfully organized over Normandy. This was not a hypothetical limitation. It was a measurable, documented constraint that shaped every German communications plan and every German operational decision throughout the final years of the war. The invisible infrastructure of American radio superiority was, by 1944, one of the most significant and least celebrated advantages that Allied forces held over their opponents. The most authoritative German assessment of American radio superiority did not come from a battlefield report or a signals intelligence summary. It came after the war was over, from a man who had survived both the conflict and the purges that consumed many of his colleagues. In March 1950, General der Nachrichtentruppe Albert Praun wrote a 250-page report for the United States Army Historical Division titled German Radio Intelligence. Praun had been appointed the last Chief of Army and Armed Forces Signal Communications on November 1, 1944, after his predecessors Erich Felgebel and Fritz Thiele were executed for their involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler. He had commanded German signals troops from the Eastern Front to the final collapse of the Reich. He understood, better than almost anyone still living, what American radio superiority had meant on the battlefield. Praun's report, originally classified and later declassified by the National Security Agency, devoted a specific chapter to the formal appraisal of United States Army radio communications. The structural decision to include such a section, alongside evaluations of Soviet and British systems, reflects the weight that Germany's senior surviving signals officer placed on the subject. This was not a footnote to German defeat. It was, in Praun's professional judgment, a factor significant enough to require systematic historical analysis 5 years after the guns had fallen silent. The full document remains available from the NSA's declassified Friedman Documents collection. The German frontline soldier had reached the same conclusion as Praun, arriving at it through direct experience rather than post-war analysis. The evidence emerged most clearly during Operation Greif in December 1944, the German deception operation during the Battle of the Bulge, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny, the commando who had rescued Mussolini from captivity in September 1943, was tasked with equipping Panzer Brigade 150 with captured American vehicles, weapons, and equipment. His men would wear American uniforms and operate American equipment behind Allied lines to spread confusion during the German offensive. Skorzeny encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated. German frontline units that had captured American equipment had kept it. Combat soldiers who had used captured American radios, vehicles, and weapons knew from direct experience that the equipment was better than their own issue, and they refused to surrender it for a special operation regardless of its strategic importance. Skorzeny obtained only a fraction of what he had requested: 4 scout cars instead of armored vehicles, 30 jeeps instead of tanks, 15 trucks instead of the armored force his plan required. The episode was not recorded as a communication story. It was, in its practical reality, exactly that. German soldiers were holding on to captured American radios because they worked better than German radios. The Battle of the Bulge itself demonstrated the decisive role of American FM communications in the most direct terms available. When the German offensive began on December 16, 1944, bad weather grounded Allied air power for critical days. The fog and low cloud that neutralized Allied aircraft also disrupted visual observation and signaling. Ground-based forward observers equipped with SCR-300 radios became the primary means of directing American artillery fire against the advancing German formations. The panzers that broke through American lines were stopped not primarily by aircraft or by armor, but by artillery. Artillery directed by observers using FM radios that continued to function in conditions that would have degraded AM communications severely. In the Pacific Theater, the SCR-300 proved equally essential in terrain that imposed its own severe constraints on communication. Telephone wire strung through jungle was severed within hours, by artillery fragments, by wildlife, by the rot that the environment accelerated relentlessly. Radio was the only reliable means of maintaining contact across the distances and terrain features of Pacific Island warfare. After the costly assault on Tarawa in November 1943, where communications failures had contributed directly to casualties, the Marine Corps conducted a systematic review of its equipment and procedures. Its conclusion was unambiguous. The Marines discarded their AM radio sets entirely and adopted Army FM equipment. It was an institutional endorsement made under the pressure of combat experience by men who understood the cost of communication failure in the most direct terms possible. The misjudgment that had allowed this gap to develop traced back to the years before the war, to a set of assumptions about American industrial and technological capacity that German leadership had constructed and then refused to revise when evidence challenged them. Hitler had told his inner circle in January 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor, that America was a decayed country, held together by nothing, incapable of sustained military production. Hermann Göring had dismissed Roosevelt's 1940 announcement of 50,000 aircraft per year as propaganda. German planners had looked at American tanks and aircraft in the late 1930s, found them adequate but unremarkable, and concluded that America possessed no decisive technological advantage in any area that mattered. They had been measuring the wrong things. They had examined the visible symbols of military power, armor, aircraft, artillery, and ignored the invisible infrastructure that determined how effectively those weapons could be used. A tank without reliable communications is a vehicle that can fight only what it can directly observe. An artillery battery without reliable communications can engage only targets it can see from its own position. A division without reliable communications from platoon to regiment is not a division in any operationally meaningful sense. It is a collection of isolated units that can neither concentrate their strength nor avoid concentrating their weakness. The men who built the tools that closed that gap deserve to be remembered by name. Edwin Howard Armstrong invented the FM technology that made it all possible, and offered his patents to the United States government without compensation for the duration of the war. He received his country's Distinguished Service Medal. After the war, he was driven to suicide by corporate litigation that consumed his fortune and health over 6 years of legal battles against a company that had used his technology without paying for it. He died on January 31, 1954. His wife Marion subsequently won more than $10 million in settlements from 21 infringement suits. The verdict vindicated his legacy. It did not restore his life. Henryk Magnuski, who holds 3 patents on the SCR 300 and whose 18-hour workdays in the Chicago factory helped produce the radio that helped liberate his homeland, could not return to Poland after the war. The Soviet government that replaced Nazi occupation was not one that welcomed returning engineers who had spent the war working for American military contractors. He remained in the United States, continued working as an engineer until his retirement, and died in 1978. His contribution to the Allied victory was largely unknown to the public he had helped protect. Daniel Noble continued at what had by then become Motorola, eventually serving as chairman of the board. The company he helped build became one of the foundations of the American electronics industry, developing technologies from pagers to cellular telephones that reshaped civilian life in the decades that followed. The industrial plants that produced these radios are mostly gone. The Galvin manufacturing facility on West Augusta Boulevard in Chicago was long since demolished and replaced. Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, the Signal Corps engineering laboratories that had employed 14,000 people and coordinated the entire radio development pipeline, was closed by the Base Realignment and Closure Commission in 2011, after nearly a century of continuous operation. The engineers are gone. The factory workers are gone. The soldiers who carried these radios are nearly gone. What remains are the primary sources. Albert Prahn's report is held by the National Security Agency. The Signal Corps assessments are preserved in military archives. The technical specifications of both American and German radios can be verified from original manuals and field reports. The production figures, the patent records, the acceptance test results from Fort Knox, all of it is documented and available. The story does not rest on memory or mythology. It rests on the kind of evidence that history requires. The lesson it carries is not complicated. Nations underestimate their adversaries at a cost that eventually becomes impossible to defer. The German High Command believed what it wished to believe about American capability and dismissed evidence that contradicted its assumptions. It looked at the visible and ignored the invisible. It measured what was easy to measure and overlooked what was difficult to quantify. The result was a strategic miscalculation of the first order, one that contributed, in ways both direct and cumulative, to the total military defeat of the Third Reich. A 5-pound handheld radio, a 38-pound backpack transmitter, an FM circuit patented in 1933 by an inventor working in a university laboratory. These were not the weapons that won the war in any simple sense. They were something more fundamental than weapons. They were the means by which every other weapon was made more effective. The invisible connective tissue of an army that could observe, decide, and act faster than its opponent at every level of command. In the end, that speed, multiplied across thousands of engagements over 3 years of fighting, was the margin that determined the outcome. That is where this story ends, not on a battlefield, but in the records of engineers, patent offices, and post-war military reports. The men who built these radios did not fire a shot, but their work shaped the outcome of the largest conflict in human history. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel. There is more history here worth knowing, and we will keep bringing it to you. Thank you for watching.